Right, everyone, it is 1 minute past 1, so we're going to give some of the stragglers another minute or two because we're feeling generous to join us. But then we'll be kicking off this fantastic lunchtime webinar, which is working from anywhere. Will it work for your business? So we will give everyone another couple of minutes and then we will make a start. If you're just joining, we have a fantastic hour set up for you. We've got a great group of speakers, all coming from different environments, who are going to talk about this super relevant topic around working from anywhere, which has been so relevant during the pandemic and now as we're emerging from it as well, and how companies can create the right operating structure for them and handle some of the difficult questions coming your way. So we've got a real expert panel on hand and we'll be starting in about 30 seconds to a minute. Okay, by my reckoning, that is definitely long enough for the stragglers. So I am going to kick this session off. So this is our lunchtime session. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Today, we have a fantastic panel who are going to be dissecting and talking about the topic of working from anywhere and will it work for your business? So I'm Romanie Thomas. I'm the founder and chief executive of Juggle Jobs. You won't be hearing a huge amount from me other than I'm going to be asking the panelists the questions as they're really the experts on the topic. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to them to do a very quick introduction. Most of you would have read their bios already, so they're not going to go into heaps and heaps of detail, and we will make sure that their information is passed to you at the end of the session. But they'll also answer the question as to why this topic is so important for them as a leader and their business today. So kicking off with Tushar from Hubble. Hello.
Hey, Romany, thanks so much for having me. My name is Tushar, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Hubble. So for the past 4 to 5 years, we were building London's largest online marketplace for renting flexible office space, where we were placing a new company in an office every 3 hours. And then since the pandemic hit, we've actually evolved our platform into a hybrid workplace platform. And really the objective is for every company to find the right balance of office and remote working for their team. And the way that we do that is really simple. We help you figure out how your team wants to work. And once we understand that, we'll then balance that with the preferences of your management team, help you find sort of a balance of working in the office, working from on-demand locations, and even investing in your work from home setup, and then be able to manage and understand that as things change over time as well. So we actually just relaunched that this morning off the back of a funding round. So it's a really opportune moment to talk about some of the trends that we've been building on.
Fantastic. And you've actually named the new product the hybrid workforce, is that right? And I know that as a term, that word is proving to be, really interesting. So we'd love to get kind of more detail from you around the definitions there. So we'll come back to that shortly. But next I want to go to Linda from Omnipresent. Hi, Linda.
Hi, Romanie. Nice to have you have me join here. So I'm Linda Wang. I'm the head of marketing and partnerships at Omnipresent. We are a global employer of record company, which simply means that we are a one-stop shop for any business looking to employ internationally. And basically, we believe that in this new world, after the pandemic, every business can be a multinational by first expanding their workforce internationally. Prior to Omnipresent, I led international expansion for a US startup while working remotely and founded 2 distributed fintech businesses. So I think this topic is super important for us and our clients as we support our clients in developing their remote first policies every day. And with remote working, clients come to us all the time asking about what are the legal, tax, payroll, benefits implications of hiring remotely. And we can basically offer them a solution that covers all of those grounds.
Brilliant. And so you were sort of driving the distributed remote model before it was kind of fashionable pre-pandemic. So really looking forward to getting deeper into this topic with you. And Linda is actually living the work from anywhere dream, and is currently in a much sunnier location as well. So we'll be learning more about that later in the session. Going on from your theme around sort of employment, legals, and the mechanics around there, we're very lucky to have an expert on the panel, Nick Pritchett. Why don't you tell us a little bit about you and your interest in this topic today?
Fantastic, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nick, I'm a consultant legal counsel at Legal Edge, and Legal Edge is a consultancy offering practical in-house advice alongside management and legal teams in small startups and scaling businesses. So for me, as both a commercial and employment specialist, dealing with this kind of remote topic is not just a sort of mechanical legal issue. It goes to the heart of the ethos of the way a lot of our clients and a lot of small businesses in the present day actually want to do business, and the way they want their workforce to operate. So it's incredibly topical. Like a lot of these things, it's also incredibly complicated. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be on board and hopefully provide some useful guidance.
Yeah, fantastic. A lot of the questions that we had inbound prior to going live today were around some of the actual legal and employment mechanics. So it'll be really useful to hear your perspective. And just before I hand over to Chris, a note to the audience that please do post your questions. We're going to leave plenty of time for questions at the end, and anything sort of very meaty that we don't cover, we'll make sure that we get answers from the panelists to you over an email, and that you have their contact details to contact them about their business, their services, and what they're talking about today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the wonderful Chris Hurd from Firstbase HQ. Hello, Chris.
Hey, Romney, how are you?
I'm all the better for speaking to you, mate.
Awesome. My screen has just went completely black, so I am totally in the dark here. Give me 30 seconds.
This is so weird because we can actually see you and you can't see us. So this is one of the beauties of remote working coming out just here. And so whilst Chris is getting set up, I'm going to go straight back to Nick. We've been talking around the various definitions here. Hybrid, work from home was obviously the big definition during the pandemic when people had to stay at home due to lockdown restrictions, and now this concept of working from anywhere. What do you see as the distinction, and do you see it as important?
So it's always been obviously sort of an informal hybrid model for some time in the UK, with home working being a sort of that hybrid model kind of being a theme of the last decade, as people realise that real life does seem to fit around. It's that international aspect that I think is the really new side of things that's becoming so widespread because of the restrictions that were in place. I mean, a lot of people with families elsewhere got caught by the restrictions, and the model has sort of evolved from there. So we've had a decade of incremental change, then suddenly this massive catalyst of of COVID hitting. But I think that illustrates one of the biggest issues for me is that the global legal and taxation system around that just doesn't recognise the concept of the global employee in that way. So we've had a real kind of step change in the way people want to work. The infrastructure is just not quite there to support it seamlessly yet. Yeah,
you're so right. We're almost trying things out, and the law is keeping up, like so many things. Tushar, I saw you nodding along there, and I know this distinction has been important for your product launch and for you as a business, and you've gone pretty deep into this space. So I'd love to get your views here.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think a lot of it is around, I think what Nick was saying was true. There was a level of flexible working pre-COVID, and generally it depended upon organizations and attitudes, but perhaps even, specific roles. But I don't think that, hybrid working was a mainstream concept. I think there was just an assumption and an expectation from almost every employer on the planet that, you know, the office was the destination and everything else was peripheral. And I think what mentality has changed over the past 14 months is, hey, maybe that doesn't need to be the case. And, you know, we've all been working from home for the past 14 months, not necessarily work from anywhere. I think some people like Linda and even Romanie yourself have been lucky to get out of your homes and work elsewhere. But actually the concept of work from anywhere is really based on work is not something, work is not a place that you go to, work is something that you do. And now that we can do most work from our laptops and our smartphones, it's really about optimizing the environment that we're in to essentially, you know, maximize employee productivity and happiness and help people find that balance of you know, work and life. And the employers fundamentally that are progressive and enable their employees to do that are going to be the ones that win, because they have the most productive employees, they can attract the best talent, and they keep the best talent on the planet. And I think it's really as simple as that.
And Chris, have we got you back now? We can see your face. So
I think I am back.
Okay,
Apologies.
Fantastic. In which case, because if for those of you who don't know, Chris Hurd is the founder and CEO of Firstbase HQ. He's going to do an intro shortly, but he's pretty vocal on Twitter around this topic. So Chris, I'd love to get your take on this kind of work from home, work from anywhere distinction, and also where some of the misunderstandings creep in.
Yeah, I think like the topic that I think's super relevant right now, and obviously there's a lot of discussion on, is around hybrid work and this desire that this is what people want. And I think there's a real problem with that, actually. The challenge that I think we face, and we're going to see massive resentment from, is what companies think remote work is and what hybrid work is very different to what individuals think hybrid work is. So typically when companies talk about hybrid work, they're talking about office first working. And what they mean by that is their expectation is that you're going to be in an office 2, 3, 4 days a week, and they're going to prescribe to you when those times actually happen. The other side of that is, and I think most workers' expectations are, that they're in control of how frequently they work remotely and where they can work remotely from. So I think we've sort of seen some of this play out already with some of the large tech companies walking back their initial pronunciations. Google are a pretty good example, I would say, where they came out and said, hey, we're going back to the office, and all their engineers allegedly went, cool, we're going to work for Facebook. And I think increasingly this is going to be something that we see, because workers, I think, are realizing that they've got a lot of power in influencing this discussion.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And we're seeing that across the board, right? Not just in this very important issue around remote and office work, but in other topics as well. I think employees are really learning to lean into their collective voice. I want to talk a bit more about what's working for your individual companies as an operating model, because we're kind of in this, we're not in the midst of the pandemic anymore. We're sort of coming out, but there's still quite a high degree of uncertainty. And we know that there's a lot of change, but what does that change look like? So Linda, I'm going to start with you. What has Omnipresent decided? So remote first, work from anywhere, office first, whatever. And can you also talk to us about what has been particularly successful about that operating model?
Sure. Yeah, I think for us, it was a no-brainer because the company started during the pandemic, and thus everyone had to work remotely from day one. And we saw this opportunity, and we kind of created this platform, this business that helped people work from anywhere. So it was a no-brainer that our own internal operating model should be the same. So that, you know, we are eating our own dog food or drinking our own champagne, basically, and enabling this for all of our teams. I think what is important to know is that, you know, we have solved the problem, and then we created a model whereby all of our employees could work this way, but we see how challenging it is for HR teams or even companies that have come from an office model to really embrace this. Because once you have, you know, a geographic concentration in one place, there is a lot of other things that go around creating a great place to work, that is around creating an existing community. So for us, it means that, we have to do kind of biannual meetups in person, whether it's in people's own countries or that we have a annual retreat. For example, this year we're taking the whole team to Montenegro, hopefully with kind of COVID restrictions allowing. So those are the things that we do internally. I think what's made it really successful for us as an operating model is that we can really say that we understand the local jurisdictions, because we have to make sure that every single employee feels supported, cared for in wherever they are working from. And the other thing is that we can really speak out about our diversity and our language support. We can tell people we are actually fluent in over 15 languages. We support all time zones across the board. As a startup, that is super hard to do if you don't really invest in outsourcing, but we can do it because of this distributed model.
Yeah, that's amazing. You can lead with just so many benefits. That's interesting what you said about the challenges that you've witnessed with customers of yours transitioning from an office model to a remote, and how it's the geographic concentration of the kind of community that makes it much harder. What you're saying about the legal jurisdiction, how impactful do you think that has been to drive a working from anywhere culture? Because on the face of it, that wouldn't necessarily be in a top 5 thing to think about, but you've mentioned it, so I'm assuming it's quite important.
Yeah, I think similar to what Tushar and Nick already mentioned in that kind of walking back, a lot of people like it at the face of it. Like, okay, we can enable, we can have less overhead potentially with the office spaces. Potentially, we can get more productivity and also get that international talent pool. But the legal and tax implications of employing internationally is super difficult, and without really, and I think the understanding around the services that we offer, which is PEO, EOR, is still like developing, so people don't really understand what services are out there. Most companies just think of, okay, we need to open a new entity in a new location in order to support this one employee, and then they do all the math and it doesn't add up to just have one employee working out somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. So then it goes back to that geographic concentration as well. That makes sense. Nick, have you seen a similar trend with some of your client base as they conceptually explore a work from anywhere operating model, but actually then they start to pull back because it just feels too complex?
I think there's definitely, I think what's a really good sign is the first instinct seems to be enthusiasm for it. And I think that's even sort of in this slightly sort of SME heading towards medium-sized businesses. So people that traditionally you'd not normally expect to see it from, they've been really supportive. And I think that's a really good step for employee relations generally. Some of them, it's not been so much been a walk back, but it's just been a kind of let's pause, let's take a breath here and actually have a look at some of the risk we're exposing ourselves to, because risk management is always going to be key on that sort of thing. And then let's find a way around it. And I think Linda's absolutely right. A lot of people immediately start on the entity route. And for a lot of them in those locations, it's just not going to be viable. So the PEO side of things becomes, I think, a useful option in that way, provided it's sort of suits the particular business, the particular need for the person in that entity. Whereas I think sort of a lot of people then still really trying to get their head around some of the concepts and actually the risk situation they're at. I think where things become a little bit sticky is where the enthusiasm has been so successful and so great that you've got people who probably have been abroad for a considerable amount of time now. And it's a question of now, how do we manage these people? They've got a reasonable expectation that we're going to support them in this, but how do we chart a way through all the considerations?
Yeah, I mean, as Chris said, because the worst case scenario is you end up with that walk back situation where during a heightened time of enthusiasm and getting the PR upside for being this progressive company, and then you're like, actually, this all feels like hard work, and walk back from that. Starting to see some really great questions coming from the audience. Just a reminder to please do post your questions. We're going to leave plenty of time for them at the end, so keep them coming. Chris, I want to touch on something that you said about these companies walking back, right? So they've said earlier in the pandemic, you can work from anywhere. We're embracing this fully distributed model. What are the objections that you're seeing from these companies, which then results in them saying, actually, we want to take it back a step? And then I'd like to sort of dissect that a little bit more. Yeah, you're the first one to do it. You're on mute.
I'm just having a disaster today with technology. Apologies. Yeah, I'd say there's a combination of factors, but I would say typically it's a lack of trust. It's this situation where companies are sort of trying to get back to a command and control type model where their comfort comes from seeing people sat in a seat, even though people have done incredible work during the most difficult circumstances imaginable. And I just think this is not something that workers are going to accept. You start to go down the path of, well, should I have to commute for 2 hours a day, 10 hours a week, 520 hours a year, giving up 4 years of my life over the course of a career to sit in a pollution emitting steel box to then slack people in the same building? It's just so dumb. Like, and I think like part of it is there's a lot of middle managers that are actually scared here, where during the pandemic, they've sort of said, well, actually, are we surplus the requirements here because we don't feel like we're busy? And we've ended up in this situation where people sitting back-to-back Zoom calls all day to make middle managers feel better about themselves, but actually at the sort of cost of people getting any work done. So I think there's a lot of problems where the people that are in control probably have too much control here. And I think the reality is workers will just leave companies that do it.
Is there some truth to that the statement that you made about middle managers, as in they're becoming surplus to requirements as we transition from more command control to kind of self-management and individual performance?
I would argue yes, but I think it's definitely not going to be a linear or quick path to that, because I think most companies are super bad at using project management software. And actually, most companies are just really bad at tracking progress of the things that they're trying to achieve. And if you can't do either of those things, it's really difficult to ever understand the output of your organization. And by sort of default thereafter, what you do is you implement hierarchy where people are effectively bottlenecks to track that progress, but they don't really do anything else. And their sort of ego's tied to feeling busy, which is how they feel productive, but actually they're not doing anything. So I would hope it flattens organizations in terms of hierarchy. Whether that ever turns out to be the case, I would say remains to be seen.
Great, thank you, Chris. Tushar, you've gone pretty deep on all of this, and I'd love to get your take on and response on what Chris has just said about, you know, the objections that you're seeing from the market, and how companies can overcome those.
Yeah, I think the point that Chris made on trust is really the key point here. Back when a few years ago, I was having trouble as a manager and a leader within Hubble, right? We tripled our team size. Things weren't quite going according to plan. And actually a fellow founder of mine sent me a book called 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And it's essentially a way to figure out what's going wrong with your team. And fundamentally, the point of that book is that trust drives teams and drives the best outcomes. And where there is a lack of trust or a breakdown in trust, that's what causes problems. And so whenever I've come across companies or individuals who have said, post-COVID, we're going to go back to the office full-time after having been remote full-time during COVID, I sort of employ something called the 5 Whys. And the 5 Whys was developed by Toyota back in the day when they had sort of the factory line and they were trying to diagnose what the problems were. So, I asked someone, why do you want your team to go back to the office 5 days a week post-COVID, considering that you've all been remote? And typically what tends to happen is that you'll get an answer, which is a superficial answer, which is, oh, this thing didn't deliver on time. Then you ask again, and then you're like, and then it comes down to maybe an individual. Oh, we just hired this new marketing person. They didn't quite work out, blah, blah, blah. Fundamentally, the fifth why is really, I don't trust this other person to do the job that I want them to do. And I think what we're seeing here is that companies who are really struggling with remote first or hybrid work being really exposed in terms of the lack of trust within the organization. Sometimes that is just to do with the sheer size of the organization and how sprawling it is. But a lot of time it's to do with policies and processes and just the operating system. I think most companies, if you want to be hybrid or remote first, if you're going to spend less than 3 days a week in the office, you need to adopt a remote first operating system, which is policies, processes, and tooling. And that way, when people are in the building physically, you can actually use that as a way to augment and amplify the interactions that they have versus using them as a crutch. And so I think there is a huge issue there. However, from what we're seeing a huge amount of employers actually embrace what's going on at the moment. And when you think about work from anywhere, we try and sort of distill all these things down into these simple acronyms and words, but fundamentally there's a couple of different dynamics at play here, right? One is that we talk about employees as if they're one thing. Employees are not a homogenous group of people. Every single one of them is a different human being, a different individual. We talk about work as just one thing, but really most knowledge work is a series of activities, right? It could be collaboration with your team. It could be deep solo work. It can be meeting a client. It can be responding to email, whatever that is. And the workplace is a series of places. It's not just you sitting at your desk. It's a meeting room. It's an event space. It's a bar. It's a restaurant, right, wherever you do your work. And I think really where the world needs to go, and this is exactly what we're trying to build here, is a method in which where you work can be customized to the individual, the person, and the time in which you're doing it, right? So different places for different activities for different people at different times. And that's really what work is about. We should stop referring to these things as homogenous. And when we think about work from anywhere, really what that comes down to is your ability to choose where you work based on what you're trying to achieve, what your personal circumstances are, and what the time is, right? If it's summertime, maybe you want to go work on a rooftop, or you want to go work in Spain, right? If it's wintertime, maybe you want to go jet off to the Caribbean, or you'd love to work somewhere with a log fire. If those things are going to make you happy, you're probably going to produce better work, right? That's really, really for us what work from anywhere comes down to. Work from home, work from abroad, work from the office, etc. are just subsets of that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tushar. I want to just come back to you again for a second and ask the question of what is the top issue that you see coming up again and again and again for companies who have this intention to be remote, to be distributed, to allow their staff to work from anywhere, but it's an issue that is complex, and then we can talk about how they overcome it, but the one that you see coming up again and again and again?
It's really, again, the tension that Chris mentioned earlier, which is the tension between the employer and employee preferences. Typically, the employer and the decision makers consist of a small group of individuals who hold a lot of power, and they have a certain objectives that's set by the board, by the shareholders, whatever that is, and that's their job to achieve that. Whereas then you have thousands of employees, all of whom have different circumstances, male, female, young, old, parents, non-parents, disabled, whatever that is. And each of those individuals has a different set of preferences over how they want to work. And so trying to essentially create a workplace which can balance what you want to do, what you want to achieve as a company, as an employer, what culture you want to build, whilst also recognizing the differences amongst those individuals. That's really where we're finding employers are struggling. And look, it's not going to be an overnight fix. It's something that's going to take time. What we see from the real estate sector is that real estate has been a one size fits all for a really long time. So the typical office lease is still a 10 to 15 year lease. And only 7% of the office market is flexible. And so, there's, even if you decide to do that, actually mapping that onto real estate solution itself is going to be challenging. And so there's a huge amount of complexity here. But I think what's the great thing that's happened is that the last 14 months have catalyzed this conversation. And I think fundamentally, the right companies will do the right thing. People will really benefit, and the planet will benefit too. So I think we'll get there, but this is just really just the beginning.
Fantastic, thank you. I want to go to Linda now. Linda, what are you seeing with the omnipresent clients and businesses that you're talking to all the time? What's the kind of number one repeat issue that comes up, even though they've got this great intention to be distributed and allow people to work from anywhere, that it's not that obvious to overcome?
Yeah, I think, again, echoing Tushar and Chris here, which is this new generation, Generation Z, or whatever you want to call it, really are looking for personalization, right? They get everything personalized now with, marketing is personalized, their entertainment is personalized, like Amazon recommendations are personalized everywhere. But when they come to work, it feels like everything is a one size fits all. And it comes from a top down level where, there is a certain amount of office kind of entertainment or, equipment is kind of coming from one place, but it's not personalized to that individual. So that when you're thinking about working from anywhere, that has a lot of implications for personalization in so many areas. Be that sense of place that that needs to take on a new definition that kind of Tushar is working on, to things like benefits, right? When you have a office place, you can determine like a bunch of people having the same benefits, but individual benefits, whether that's from salaries to compensation to things like healthcare, when you have to take into account so many factors. For example, one of my teammates is 2 meters tall, but in an office situation, he would sit on, any chair that's given to him. But, he needs something that's more economic and makes sense for his size, right? And taking that kind of personalized approach towards benefits, perks, benefits, compensation takes a lot of effort. And there's no one internally well placed enough. Like the HR managers are really struggling. The employers, the CEOs, they get escalated all of these concerns and questions, but no one's there really to support them in answering them. So I think that's really something that's come up again and again. Like, the legal team is coming in, the finance team is coming in, the HR teams are trying to pull all of these concerns together. And it's that level of complexity that's kind of putting everything in standstill. And hence people just think it's easier to kind of go back to the office.
Okay, so if a company's, I'm going to direct this to Chris, because I think that's a really interesting point. We're moving from, say if we're moving from command and control, and we're moving from the kind of simplified operating system, which is, this might not work for everyone, but it's the system that we've got and you've got to buy into it. And if we're moving to a much more personalized model, that on the face of it sounds much more complex. Why isn't it? How can it not be overly complex for businesses? Because I guess in order to make this transition, it needs to be better than what we've got
Sure.
today.
Yeah, I think Linda's pulled on a great thread, which is like go back to the Industrial Revolution and trace that path through to today. And what we're talking about is like mass-produced working, where everyone works the same way. 9 to 5, people attend offices. And what's really produced is a situation where work is designed for the collective rather than the individual. And I think what actually occurs when you switch to allow individuals to personalize not just their work day and their schedule and where they can work is you actually enable people to do better work than they've ever produced. You enable them to be more efficient and effective. And I think actually like the benefit to the company is obviously monumental off the back of that. They're the beneficiaries of people being happier and having a better quality of life and having better balance in their lives. There's obviously challenges. I think we've obviously alluded to some of them. I think the thing that has to occur is not replicating the office remotely, which is really easy. And we need to embrace and leverage in many respects the benefits that remote work brings. So how can we transition from a time where we've been working synchronously? And I think everyone knows that in some respects, offices have become these like adult kids clubs where people come over and they tap you on the shoulder and say like, hey, what's going on? Like, and you just never have the ability to do deep focused work. And obviously there's spaces in physical locations, so I'm not entirely denigrating them, but yeah, it's about how can we put our individuals in a better position to do better work without those distractions. And yeah, I think it's certainly not as straightforward, but I think there's a lot of benefits that come from doing that.
We've got some really good questions coming in from the audience. So I'm actually going to move to Q&A a little bit sooner than we intended to. So I'm going to ask you all one or two more questions, and then we'll move straight on to Q&A. We hear the word culture a lot when we talk about office and work from anywhere, and there does seem to be a lot of fear that an office culture is, an office is very central to building a culture. Is there some truth in that? And if so, how can companies build a remote culture? In which case, Chris, I'm going to go straight to you.
Yeah, I've got some pretty strong views on this. Like, culture is bullshit. Like, and typically the companies that are saying, hey, we really need to go back to the office because our culture is so great. And as soon as you do that, you see a company that's typically super homogenous. They lack diversity of everything. And I just think it's a really sort of unworthy goal to have. Like, we're going to force people back into this box, and that's going to limit our access to great talent. Like, it makes it difficult for single parents to work at the office. It makes it difficult for people that are caring for other people to work there. It makes it difficult for people who may have health conditions or impairments that are sort of super uncomfortable working in office, or they physically can't. So I think when people say that, they're usually trying to cover for things that they can't explain, but it's just this catch-all phrase that people sort of use homogeneously. And I think what I'm sort of interested by and what I find intriguing is transitioning from a world where you apply that filter and you start to look at it through the lens of internal community. And I think there's a lot of people who have written some great stuff on this. Probably the best is some of the stuff that Reed, forget his last name, Reed Hastings from Netflix has written. And yeah, we're transitioning from a situation where people use the other thing, which is we're a family at work, which also bullshit. Like, there's just so much nonsense that I think people peddle and use as an excuse to try and go back, which, yeah, I don't think is the right way to think about it.
So actually, it's about being aware of those bullshit items first, and diversity, as you mentioned, is very central to that argument against. Nick, you come from the world of law, which has a reputation for being a tad traditional, and so I'd love to get your view on this kind of topic of building culture in a remote world. Is it possible? Does it get diluted? What are your thoughts, and from what you've seen?
Yeah, I agree to a certain extent to sort of Chris's sentiments there. It's the definition of culture. I think the whole scenario has changed so much from that 9-to-5 office presence, and I'm going to have 4 meetings dotted throughout the day, and then the rest of the time I'll be at my desk working. Culture arose as a result of people being in the same position at the same time, and that I think we can sort of almost consign that to previous culture. If you're going to define culture these days, I think it will be defined by the way people are actually doing things. So I do agree with Chris that companies that are able to understand and I'll use the word personalize, because I think that's a good way to do it. That's the culture that will come through. It will bring its own challenges, I think, and without getting too bogged down in the employment technicalities of it, there's the issue of will we see the concept of kind of remote discrimination coming in, where people who perhaps aren't, who don't come in the office at all, treated less favorably, than people who do come in once or twice a week for physical meetings and that kind of thing. You know, part-time workers are already protected of the law, so will we see that way? So I think that all of those sort of considerations into how we think about the people that work with us or for us, depending which way you want to go, that will form the basis of this new culture. And I think it's just going to take some real lateral thinking and a lot of perhaps understanding iteration, trial and error in terms of as businesses find their feet in the new world.
Brilliant. Remote discrimination. I think you've just given us the subtopic for the next webinar. That's great. Thank you. Linda, question for you, because Omnipresent is growing really, really quickly. How do you hire for culture in a remote world?
Yeah, I think, and I mentioned this in a conversation before, we're not looking for cultural fit. We're trying to look for cultural add, right? So again, it's like, if you're looking for people that are homogenous, then you want people to fit in, right? And that becomes discriminatory in its own sense. But if you're thinking as a culture, as what are you missing from your existing culture and what can you add? Is it cultural diversity? Is it diversity of thought? Is it skill set? Like, what is it that you want to add to your existing culture? And then you hire for that. And that's a much better way, in our opinion, of looking at culture. And also at offices, right? They used to be a one-stop shop for friends, for work, for your community, and then back and forward from your commute. Like, this needs to take on a new definition. And for us, you know, we want to see it maybe as a hub for meetings, maybe as a space for creating in-person connections. So I think there's just a lot to look at there. And the way that we hire people is really to look for people who can work together and have the skills fit for the role that they've applied for, and also that, you know, they can work in an international environment.
I love that. It's being much more objective around the skills and the delivery of that person. And then also looking to the future, what is the culture that we want to build, rather than thinking about fit for today. I love it. Right, we are running a bit late on time. We've got some great questions, so I'm going to go straight into it. We've got a question from, oh my goodness, we've got loads of questions. Okay, great question. Is head of remote working the new head of HR appointment going forward for companies that want remote working? Changing the title focuses the change and emphasis in the role and the delivery method and how they even go about it. Tushar, thoughts?
Maybe is my answer. I think it kind of depends on your company. I think what I'd say is that, yes, it does. I agree with the focus on remote. So what it does, it focuses someone on it, but fundamentally it should be, you know, instrumental to the operating culture of your business. And so what we're seeing quite frequently is that, you know, head of HR, head of people ops, COO, CEOs are all having this conversation together. And I think the benefit would be that you have someone who focuses on it, but the downside could be that that person works in isolation and is constantly battling other people within the organization to make that stuff happen. So yeah, maybe that's true. We've seen that certainly happen in remote first organizations. A really great example is Hopin, who have got about, I think, 350 employees worldwide, and they're scaling up pretty quickly. They actually brought on a head of remote during the beginning of their scaling up phase of their headcount. And I think they've got an entire team enabling that to happen at the moment. And I'm sure you'll see other companies do the same. But I think you run the risk of basically that department having its own agenda and then having to battle with other departments to force their agenda through. It really has to be something which you know, the management team, the C-level are talking about, and the employees are involved in too. But if that person is coordinating that dialogue, then great, absolutely.
Yeah, I see what you mean. So from the question, actually, yes, having someone dedicated is good, but if it's in isolation of the C-suite being brought into it, then it's likely to fail. Okay, good. I've got a question for Nick. What about the laws that restrict the environment that people work in? DSC and workstation assessments are statutory law.
Yeah, a really good point to pick up on there, because we a lot of the headlines are about the international problems. But just even setting up working from home in the UK, particularly businesses that perhaps have sort of conceived during the pandemic times, have never had that physical presence, there still needs to be an awareness of the infrastructure that you're dealing in. And from the legal side, that office, that home working environment is a legal extension of your employment area. So all your responsibilities, display screen equipment, making sure someone's not going to completely do over their back, working sort of, you know, from inappropriate laptop, that kind of thing. Those duties still apply. Now, likelihood, you've got a very kind of young, forward-thinking workforce. It might not be top of their minds, but what you've got there is latent risk exposure that's sat there, and you won't know about it until there's an issue. And that's the sort of problem that perhaps a lot of people are storing up and just not sort of assessing as they go.
For anybody who's on the call and wants to go a bit deeper, particularly into some of these legal issues, don't worry, we are going to be sharing contact details of the panelists, so you'll be able to contact them directly. Just on that theme, and I'm going to go to Linda, how do companies get around the possibility that they incur double the amount of costs of legalities change, i.e. they give up the office to save on leasing but incur extra costs to provide choice, therefore having to hire space in a managed service office, potentially employees wanting utilities at home covered, buying furniture for home and office, career costs, etc. Will a meeting at the office mean the employee now expects travel expenses, also moving away from the office, resulting in redundancy costs? I know I said I was going to direct this to Linda, but rereading the question, I might actually direct this to Chris instead. Chris, were you listening?
I was listening, yeah.
Good, okay, great.
Yeah, I think it's obviously a question that almost every company comes to us with, and I think the implication is that a lot of companies are making a decision to scale back their commercial real estate footprint fairly significantly. How they're thinking about that is they're cutting back on bespoke HQ, and they're moving to more flexible situations, which they can scale up and down as required. So I think when you start to think of it in those terms, you say, well, right now companies are paying $10,000 to $50,000 per worker per year on bespoke office space, depending on which city in the world that they're in. If you're a 1,000-person company, that's $10 to $50 million of cost, which you effectively can cut or redistribute to spending on flexible workspace. The other side to that equation is, well, what happens with our people at home? They need desks and chairs and peripherals and keyboards and mice. And companies obviously come to us for that. And in terms of, I guess, the business case that we would present to workers, to companies that do come to us, typically it's a 40 to 60% saving when they do provide a great remote work experience and probably flex space for 2 or 3 days a week if they need it.
How interesting. So it's you say that if they get into the mindset of distributing the cost, that's the best place to start, and then actually they end up saving money as well.
I mean that 40 to 60% can be as high as we were speaking to a company in San Francisco, 2,000 people spending $100 million a year on real estate. If they went fully remote, which looks like they're about to, their overall cost to provide people with the best remote work experience possible is going to be about $3 million a year. So their overall savings, $97 million.
Yeah, cool. Another question for Nick. From a finance perspective, there's quite a bit of confusion around when a tax position arises. How long can an employee work from anywhere before tax complications arise, for example? How do we track this, account for this? Is there any software that can help? Great question.
Yeah, I'll take that in sort of the two parts it falls into. I mean, the first one, it's incredibly detailed per jurisdiction that you're talking about, but as a general rule, a lot of, let's take the UK as an example. Someone coming into the UK as effectively just a tourist or holiday visitor is enabled to participate in meetings with their company, but they're not really able to do any substantive work. And that situation is reflected and slightly different across the various jurisdictions where you find you might have employees working. So the very general answer, it's very tricky from day one. A lot of the tax obligations in terms of in-country income tax, social security contributions will likely arise a bit later down the line if someone's been in situ for, say, anything over 2 months, down to sort of the 6 months, where you get sort of the real problems. Leaving aside the overall point about what happens if someone is in a different country, employed under a UK contract, for example, but concluding contracts on the UK company's behalf, that's going to open a whole door on permanent establishment and corporation tax risk that could find yourself in some pretty tricky water very quickly. The second part on software, I've not seen anything specific on that, but I'm always ready to stand corrected if anyone's got any views on that. But I find this sort of service, in terms of helping localize from an awareness perspective of what's required and where your thresholds are, and importantly, where you can push them to enable this working to take place. A lot of PEOs do that. In some cases, local law firms, local accountancy firms, local payroll providers, and as I said, yeah, the PEOs generally encompass a lot of that, so they'll have that on their sort of talent list to be able to deploy for their clients.
Interesting. Sounds like a big problem that maybe needs to be solved for the entrepreneurial folk on the line today who are looking for a startup idea. But I'm going to move a similar theme, but slightly different, and straight on to Linda. We are a UK company looking to expand into the USA. We're being encouraged to set up a company in Florida or Texas, as these are beneficial to us from an employment law point of view. Additionally, we are being advised to stay away from New York for the opposite reasons. If our employees are work from anywhere, are they protected by their local jurisdictions from where they work, or protected under UK employment as we are a UK company?
Again, a lot of potentially tax and legal questions in there. I'm not a lawyer or a tax advisor, so I can't really answer on their specific cases.
I can go to. Should we go to Nick for those?
Yeah, I think the only thing I can probably answer is that they would not be protected under their UK contracts, but I'll leave that to Nick to answer.
Fantastic. Nick, do you have some thoughts on this question?
Yes, yeah, it was a good one. I saw that pop up before. I mean, the states one is really interesting. So cherry picking your state, I think, is very important. And the reality is, if anyone is based and actually doing their work substantively from one of the United States, then that state's employment laws will apply to that relationship. There's very few exceptions where if someone's actually doing that for a significant amount of time, being even sort of up to a month, then that will apply. They will also potentially retain the option to bring claims against their UK employer under the UK contract. But if you are doing that in an unmanaged way, you're effectively giving employees the ability to cherry pick which jurisdiction to hit you with in the worst case.
Interesting. We've got actually an answer on the software tool question from one of the members of the audience. There are software tools available to track employee movement and tax legal risk. KPMG, for example, has a great tool, but naturally, given the source, it's expensive. Okay, good to know. I think this is a really interesting question, something that we're seeing coming up again and again. One for you, Tushar. We have a digital first approach, allowing our employees how, when, and where to work. No pressure to work in the office at all. We also employ outside of the UK through an EOR. Before pandemic, flexibility was given, but most of the people wanted to work in the office. Question from our employees: how do you ensure that these employees that choose to work remotely don't feel like second-class citizens?
I think this comes back to two related questions we've had so far. I think the first one is around culture. And I know Chris's views on culture. I think culture is important, and I think culture can be objective. It's not just about hiring people who are like yourself. And if you think about what it takes to feel part of something or someone somewhere, you have to think about like how frequently you interact with them, whether that's online or offline. And what we found is that even when we were all in the office, typically people would be sitting at the desk most of the time. Sometimes they'd be interacting with each other in breakout areas or coffee spaces. But a lot of the real sort of like bonding used to happen in company events, whether they were company drinks or lunches, et cetera, et cetera. And so we were finding that you could actually build a strong collective or a group or a culture within the company and sort of evolve people from being colleagues into being friends by having interactions maybe once every couple of weeks or once a month, or a big event once a quarter. So I think what we're starting to see is, in the absence of those accidental bump-ins, those classic water cooler conversations, there's a few things that people can do intentionally. So intentionally, we're starting to see companies start to bring back some of those social events. So they're using the physical space to actually create more and more collaboration or social events, rather than you go there and work at a desk. You go there to interact with your colleagues, right? I was actually on a panel a few weeks ago, and the question I got asked was, how do you prevent people who are coming to the office using it as a social space rather than the workspace? And my answer was, it's probably now going to be used as a social space rather than workspace, because that's where people feel that they can socialize and they can work from anywhere. The other thing that we're seeing is more sort of organized remote social activity as well. So we're seeing, our company itself has something called a donut, which operates on Slack, and it pairs one individual with another individual every week. And they have like a virtual coffee or a discussion. We had a few Swedish employees, and they brought fika to our company a few years ago, which is coffee and cake at 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. every day, where you sort of shut your laptops and you just have a chat. We did that in the office previously. Now we do that remotely, and people can drop in, where and where they like. And so there's lots of things that we can do to make sure that that happens. And we do believe that culture is important, and the way that we measure that is not whether everyone is alike, but whether everyone shares the same values and mindset. And that's kind of what we hire for, and that we make sure that we're catalyzing the bonding by having those either remote or physical rituals. The other thing was around the reallocation, redistribution of budget, depending on where people want to work. So that's, again, really what New Hubble is all about, is looking at that rent line. Typical cost in London is £500 per employee per month. And if people are using the office less than they used to before, how can you redistribute and reallocate that cost to make sure that they're having a great experience wherever they work, whether that's in the office or whether that's at home or whether that's a local co-working space or a coffee shop, whatever that is. And so really what we're starting to see is that budget reallocation will work differently for different people. So you may have some people who work from home 80% of the time, and actually, £400 of that £500 budget is allocated to making sure that their work from home setup is really, really great, and they're experiencing some of those same benefits that they would have in the office. And some of those people who are spending more time in the office are actually getting more access to local co-working spaces or a dedicated desk in the office. That's kind of how we see this world going. That infrastructure, we're still building. It doesn't quite yet exist, but there are ways that you have to almost be more intentional and more organized in how people interact, rather than it accidentally happen. Again, you can be a bit too much. You can be like a school teacher and say, this is mandatory fun time. And so, we learned from that, and we basically allow very casual conversations to happen. People can drop in and out whenever they want to, but we also have events and activities that people are really encouraged to attend. A lot of it really comes down to the role of the HR manager or the people ops manager, the COO, changing to really accommodate that.
Brilliant, thank you. Loads of detail in that answer. Thank you, Tushar. And we'll be sharing a lot of the key points and highlights. And we actually have a little bit longer than I thought, which is great because we actually have loads and loads of questions. So this is a question for Linda and Nick. We want to run a true remote working company and are interested in thoughts on how. If we hire in the UK on a UK employment contract, but the employee wants to go to Bali and work remotely for 2 months, how does this work and where do we stand?
Again, I think we help on I think there's another delineation of digital nomads versus work from anywhere culture, which is more that you're hiring local people who are necessarily in one country rather than traveling abroad from one place to another. I think from the surface level, there is something as a 183-day rule in most countries, but I'll probably let Nick expand on that.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. I think that's a really good distinction. With the scenario in the question, you obviously got a UK employment relationship, and again, yeah, it's that travel to somewhere. Bang on with the 183 days in terms of some of the tax side of things, but it will also depend on the seniority of this person and what they're doing. the risk profile sort of goes up, the more outward facing they are. So if you had sort of someone who generally delivers services internally, then you're going to have less of a risk profile in terms of the Balinese tax authorities coming after you, or in fact adverse consequences for the employee, which I think is also one of the big issues here. So I think anyone sort of adopting that sort of approach needs to familiarize themselves, and there are a lot of free resources available online for this kind of thing. Familiarize themselves with the sort of the issues for the employer, potentially if you're allowing someone to go somewhere for 2 months. But I think also then key is identifying the potential issues for the employee. Yes, it's going to fall on their responsibility ultimately, but having that dialogue with them and walking them through some of the issues they could face in that way, I think that's part of supporting this whole move on the nomadic side.
Brilliant, thank you. Chris, question for you. The focus of the discussion seems to be on efficiency, productivity and oversight. Whilst work from home is brilliant, flexible and convenient, do you think we're missing out on key development and growth opportunities by being in person with each other, learning, camaraderie and shared understanding, particularly for juniors to learn from senior staff through osmosis by watching how they act and make decisions? I don't think Zoom is an adequate substitute for this.
I tend to disagree. I think if you ask an old person, that's typically what their assumption is, what young people want and need. But when you ask young people, most of them say, kind of want to live where I want to live closer to my family, want to live closer to friends. And I think if you look back historically, what's happened is people have left behind family and friends in search of opportunities, and they end up living in expensive cities with a high cost of living, where they've got no disposable income and they're in shared apartments. And that's an implication of the high cost of living in cities and having to be close enough to commute daily. The second part around learning and osmosis, I disagree again. I think this is an entire generation that's grown up building relationships digitally. They learn on YouTube. They've spent the last two years learning at university digitally. And I sort of take the point around learning from more senior members of staff, but what do they actually learn? Like most knowledge-based jobs send emails nowadays. They work in documents. They attend meetings. What's any different to being in a Zoom meeting to being in the room with someone? There are certain things I would concede. I think communication and collaboration probably is better in person. But I think once that's conceded, the people that think the office is so much better probably have to answer the question of how much better. It's not 50% better. It's not 20% better. Maybe it's 10% better, depending on how many times you've been with someone physically. And I think the final part is just because you're remote doesn't mean you never see people physically. I think this whole piece around like the office being the anchor of social life, I think this has led to many of the societal issues we face around meaning and personal relationships. Should your employer select the people you spend most time with? Probably not. Should you probably have better relationships outside of work if you had more time and you weren't commuting? Probably. So I think a lot of this is like laid on the it's an issue with remote, when actually remote enables you to spend more time with people you choose. And yeah, I think the other stuff's overblown.
Yeah, I think you raised a really interesting point there. One about how young people are actually very used to learning in this environment. So perhaps the shift is coming from the older generation instead, but they know how to build digital relationships. And the second one, you touched on it, which is around documentation. And, you know, if you're running a remote first operating system, chances are you've got to have really good processes and good documents. And that's a big part of how people learn and how companies scale. This is an interesting question. I'm going to direct it to Tushar. How can we control the environment? Work from anywhere could be a coffee shop.
Of course it could be. If you enjoy working, lots of people find coffee shops productive environments to work in. It's probably not the most productive environment to have to be on a Zoom webinar, but it may be a perfect and productive environment to write a blog post or write 10 emails. And I think a lot of it comes down to trust, right? And optionality. So if you give your staff optionality in environments that they can work in, and you give them trust to behave like adults rather than children, then if they are on a Zoom webinar, which requires really high-speed internet, really good sound quality, quiet background, they probably shouldn't be sitting in a Costa coffee. And the vast majority of people will be able to make that decision without their manager telling them that that's what they need to do. But if they want to get out of the house, they want a nice cup of coffee and a piece of cake, and they just want to get some stuff done for a couple of hours, and they like the ambient noise, yes, of course, they should work from that coffee shop. And I think because one of the things that we're seeing more and more is because we've all worked from home for the past 14 months, we associate remote working with work from home. And actually, that's just not true. Remote working is just not working in your office building, but there's plenty of other environments where you could get work done that could be productive for that point in time. I do understand the point around the sort of controlling the environments. We see when we talk to a lot of large corporates, they want to be able to control, especially if we have something like the Hubble Pass, which is over 200 locations. They want to be able to control where their team can and can't go. And so typically we do curate those places with respect to having good facilities, making sure that they have great access, that the opening hours are fine, that the internet works, that they have receptions that people can ask questions to. But fundamentally, it really should be up to people to determine where they work best. And can you build that trust? And you know what will happen? Someone will do a Zoom webinar from a Costa Coffee, really struggle, and then never do it again because they'll learn their lesson, right? And those lessons are learned very, very quickly. So I think I wouldn't be too worried about that.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got a really interesting question here, which is, it's quite a broad one, so I'm going to direct it initially to Nick, but I'd love to get thoughts from perhaps all of you on this. What are the legal implications of employing people around the world? Visa, takes, insurance, etc. Nick, if you could perhaps distill that down into maybe top 2 or 3.
Sure. He says,
sorry, big question.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think it's definitely not 3, and I'm sorry about this, but in terms of just the fundamental, one of my initial considerations as an employer when I want to employ people internationally in a remote basis would be looking at the permanent establishment corporation. Then you've got the income tax and social security side. You've got the immigration rights. Do they actually have, the employee has the right to stay there? Is there some, how do we process information about this employee without falling foul of data protection laws locally? And then what are the local employment laws? We talked about already things like the displacement equipment and health and safety here. A lot of territories, particularly EU ones, have far more stringent health and safety obligations where people work outside of the office. So making sure that we've actually thought about those and found a way to navigate those things. So those, as a real general kind of guidance, those would be the major topics that I consider. Obviously, that's purely on the regulatory side, and I'll leave it to others on the on perhaps sort of the cultural and involvement side.
Tushar, thoughts on the cultural implications here?
Culture.
That word
it's for me, we're talking about a lot of extremes here, right? Pretty much the entire debate for the past 14 months has been binary. It's been work from the office or work from home or work remotely. And fundamentally, people on both sides of the argument are making really valid points. And what it comes down to is finding a balance of both, right? So we talked a little bit about learning and development and osmosis and all that sort of stuff. Really, if you think about, we're talking about young people, if you think about how young people learn, they do a bit of learning in person at school. They come back and do their homework on their own, right? And then they're digitally messaging all their mates on Snapchat. They're doing all of that, right? And we're kind of doing that at work too. And it really is finding the right balance of what is the right physical environment you should be in for what type of activity. And yes, of course, we're all humans, we're all tribal beings. We need to get together sometimes, right? And so I think the cultural implications are are interesting. I think a lot of it comes down to the employers being intentional in how they communicate, intentional in how they essentially enable interactions between the employees. There should certainly be screens on hiring. So, whether you're hiring for like values or culture, is this person going to be right for this sort of organization? Because a lot of those employers are now branding themselves. The employer brand is to do with how they've chosen to work. So Goldman Sachs and Netflix have branded themselves as full-time office companies. So what they're doing really is they're saying, if you value flexibility, remote working, hybrid working, don't come and work at Goldman Sachs or Netflix. But if you actually really value being in the office full-time 5 days a week, this is the place for you. And all that's going to do is attract the people with the same mindset. And what they believe is that that's going to create sort of, better staff retention because they're all, much more like-minded. And on the opposite side of the spectrum, you've seen employers like Spotify and Salesforce do the same thing. So actually workplace strategy in itself is becoming how you sort of draw the line of what your culture is. And previously with a lot of tech companies, you couldn't tell the difference, right? All of them were progressive and had great offices and blah, blah, blah. Now, if you're applying for a job at Spotify and at Netflix, you're probably not going to go work at Netflix if you want more and more flexibility. And I think really that's where culture is really coming into play.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I almost disagree with everything that Goldman's have said in the last year, despite them being a hugely successful organization, but you do know where they stand, which is very different to a lot of the tech companies who have benefited from the PR uplift of being all progressive and then backtracking later, which is so much worse because they've attracted people off the back of that. I want to get final thoughts from all of you. One piece of advice that you will give the audience today about how they can successfully transition to helping their employees to work from anywhere. Linda, can I start with you, please?
Sure. I think, well, obviously a plug for Omnipresent. So if you are struggling to employ people anywhere, do come to us because we have thought through these questions and more from every kind of type of business, from kind of your 1-2-man bands to literally, companies of hundreds of employees. That's like, Omnipresent can help you employ internationally, but in terms of all of the other questions about what work means now, I think work really needs to be much more personalized, like everyone has said, and taking that personalization strategy, something you would do in, your marketing job or your, targeting of your services, apply that to your own company, apply that to your own employees, and think about what would that mean for my employees if I were to personalize everything, treat it almost like a product, and then you can brand it and brand your employer brand in that way that would track the people that would do the best work for you. So I think that's my main takeaway.
Great, thank you, Linda. Nick, what about you?
I think it's so important to have a considered position. Make sure you've thought through and had some intel on the risks, and then have a position. It doesn't need to be a formal policy as per se, but have a position that allows people to be treated not the same, but consistently when it comes to this sort of thing, and then just communicate and engage with them ahead of time. And that way, you're taking account of their personal needs as well as trying to marry that with the employment and other risks that you're facing.
That's great. That's great advice, Nick. Really like that a lot. Chris.
Yeah, my advice would be probably related to the Goldman stuff. I think I'd probably pose a question more than give a statement. I was actually speaking to some of the A16Z guys about this a couple of weeks ago, and the question was, what happened to every company that didn't embrace computing, adopt software, embrace the internet? And the answer is that they all died, right? Like any company that didn't do that in the 80s, the 90s, or the 2000s are slowly being killed. And I think that there's a similar metaphor that you can use is what happened to Amazon versus the department stores. So all the reasons that those organizations got crushed by the rise of tech and the rise of the internet are the same reasons that organizations are going to get crushed by not embracing remote work. It's about access to talent, cost efficiency, choice, convenience, and all these things. And yeah, I think my suggestion would be, if companies don't embrace remote working, they probably won't exist 10 years from now. And yeah, today's the best chance to get in front of that, and obviously do that before your biggest competitors do, because I think what we're going to see with Goldman is they're going to lose a hell of a lot of their most talented people who have decided they want to work remotely. And it becomes an incredibly easy decision for them to say, well, Goldman won't let me work remotely, but HSBC will, or Citigroup will, or JP Morgan Chase will. And yeah, I suspect we're about to live through the highest period of turnover in history across the next 2 or 3 years as individuals optimize for that situation that suits their working styles.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris is really shy and doesn't have strong views at all. Tushar, can you wrap up and also tell us a little bit about the new product at Hubble as well, which is very central to this afternoon's discussion?
Yeah, I think just to riff off Chris's sort of retail example, I think that's actually a really, really poignant one, which is the retailers that didn't embrace digital got left behind very, very quickly. What is quite interesting, though, is that a lot of those digital first retailers also now have a benefit from physical presence, but they don't benefit from that presence in terms of selling goods. It's more of a branding exercise. It's there for a specific reason, right? And I think that's the same way that the office and the remote conversation will go. You will have to, when you ask your employees to come in or do something that is top down, they're going to ask why. And if you don't have a good enough answer for why, then you're going to lose the trust of your employees. If you've got a great answer for why, then fair enough, right? And a lot of it is about building trust within the organization and having a constant open dialogue between the employer and the employees. Fundamentally, flexibility, autonomy, and optionality is the #1 demand from workers worldwide. That's, it was already high on the agenda pre-COVID. It's now the #1 on the agenda. And that's exactly what we're seeing across every single company. Quick, plug on Hubble, as we've hosted the webinar. Hubble, we've launched as a hybrid workplace platform. Really, it's about looking at your rental costs, which is typically your second highest cost in your business, and being able to reallocate and redistribute that cost to make sure that you're spending in the right way. So if your business is going to go to a 20%, HQ-based model with 40% of time spent in on-demand workspaces and another 20% spent in at home, we want you to be able to take that office budget and either reduce it to make sure you're not spending money on office space you're not needing, or reallocate that to make sure that everyone's having a really great and personalized workspace experience. Part of that product is something called the Hubble Pass, which is an on-demand, it's essentially a class pass for workspace product, is on-demand access to over 200 workspaces worldwide. Actually, that may even be 250 this week. And what that allows companies to do is give their employees access to locations which are central, where they can meet, locations which are local to where people live so they can get out of the house, and locations which are central for international distributed teams as well. And for everyone on the webinar, we're doing a 1-month free trial on that, where each of your employees can get 4 free passes in the month, and they can go check out a bunch of different spaces. So we'll send an email straight after this webinar. If you sign up, you can pretty much activate straight away and get going.
Super, thank you very much. We've run slightly over, so I'm going to wrap up here. Just a big thank you to Linda, Chris, Nick, and Tushar. Wonderful comments on such an important topic. We will send a follow-up email to everyone and make sure that you get access to the speakers and the companies that they're driving forward in this space as well. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much.